Hey everybody, today we are debating capitalism versus communism, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate. This is going to be a lot of fun. Want to let you know if it's your first time here at Modern Day Debate, we host debates on politics, science, and religion. And we are very excited to let you know we're a nonpartisan channel. In other words, only the debaters are making the cases here. We as a channel just kind of keep it zipped, you could say, and then also, we have no after shows in which we take sides or anything like that. It's up to you, the audience members, to decide who you thought was more persuasive. We also want to say, no matter what walk of life you're from, we do hope you feel welcome here. And with that, I want to let you know about the format. It's going to be fairly simple. In particular, our capitalist friends will be leading first. Following that, our communist friends will go, or socialist in this case, and in addition, it'll be roughly 15 minutes from each side. Then, after their 15-minute openings, it'll be open conversation followed by Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to fire it into the old live chat. If you tag me with @ModernDayDebate, it makes it easier for me to get every question in that list. Also, Super Chat is an option. If you do a Super Chat, you can also not only ask a question for the Q&A, but you could make a comment for it, in which case that speaker or speakers would get a chance to, of course, respond to it, and it'll also push your question or comment to the top of the list for the Q&A. So, want to let you know, I have linked our speakers who have given me links down in the description, and then Krampus, if I remember right, I will be adding his as well. Want to say, we are very excited. So let me first thank our speakers, as we are really happy to have them here. Alex, Snake, Brenton, and Krampus, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Very excited. I don't know if you can see, I wore my Lenin shirt since I told you this would happen.
You look tremendous. And we are very excited, folks, as we will get the ball rolling. You will see at the bottom right of your screen, though, of course, you will see Brenton looking tremendous in the bottom right as well. And he has a debate coming up with Sargon on whether or not trans women ought to be able to compete in women's sports. So that should be a juicy one. And with that, we're going to let our capitalist friends take the ball and run with it. So, Alex and Snake, thanks so much. The floor is all yours.
All right. Alex, did you want to go first, or should I just jump in?
Sure, I might as well just go first. Might as well. All right. So I think the key point here is that you need resources to live your life, and there are only 4 ways to get them. You can produce them yourself, you can steal them from others, you can be given them for free, or you can engage in some sort of exchange for them. So the first one doesn't really work. Producing even a tiny fraction of the resources you consume yourself is essentially impossible. You need knowledge, you need tools, you need a whole lot of stuff. And even if some individuals would like to live completely self-sufficiently, currently the world population can't be sustained that way. So next, stealing, it's risky, it's costly, there's fighting involved, which involves the consumption of other resources. And I don't think anyone here is really advocating a system primarily on theft. So the only 2 other ways are charity and exchange. And the key point I'd like to emphasize is that capitalism allows all of the charity that is allowed and is permissible under communism, except it also offers additional tools of mutually beneficial exchange, specifically for those cases when the charity is not sufficient. So I have a couple features of capitalism which I would say differentiate it from alternatives. So these include private property, the use of money, charging rent and interest, and external equity ownership of firms. So first for money. So money solves the double coincidence of wants problem. So if you have a service that I offer, but I don't want a service that you offer, money is an intermediary which would allow you to trade the service of others for my service. Also, critically, it demonstrates the value of the good in some way. So if I make an exchange, one good for another, or some amount of money for a good, it demonstrates that I value that good to some degree, and that demonstration of value has, as a feedback mechanism, guides production, which allows people and producers to understand what it is that needs to be produced in the first place. Then next to rent, that allows exchange to occur over time or partial ownership. So say, I would like to exchange for something you have, however, I don't want full exchange. Maybe I want to borrow your bike for, just a couple of weeks or something like that. Rent allows you to have that sort of partial exchange as opposed to a complete exchange. And next, there's interest. So interest allows exchange to occur over time. So I may want something that you have now, but I don't have enough to exchange for it now. So if the person I'm exchanging with has to wait, they may not be willing to make that exchange unless I compensate them for that. And the thing I have to compensate is the risk that I don't pay it back, as well as the time, because goods now are more valuable than goods later. So if they're not going to simply give me that service, if they're not simply going to give it to me for free, then they should be allowed, I would say, to offer that in exchange for interest. Now, external ownership of the firms is similar in that it has the same advantages of interest, except also some additional value in that it has less risk. So if, for example, the capitalists own a firm and that firm doesn't ultimately make a profit, they would take the loss as opposed to the workers. So I think a key point here is that risk in production is an inherent fact of production and not unique to capitalism. So whenever a good or service is produced, there's a chance that it will not be as desired as the workers who produced it expected. It could be that preferences change. It could be that the good is novel and it's just not as desirable. So that risk is always there. The difference is that capitalism offers tools to sort of align incentives with the mitigation of that risk and allows that risk to be mitigated. So in the past, I've heard communists try to solve these problems sort of by asserting that the society just takes care of the needs for all. And I'd say that this is a false solution. Getting back to the key point I was making earlier, is that charity is still permissible under capitalism. There's nothing about capitalism that stops people from taking care of each other, taking care of their neighbors, from being generous, from being kind. The only difference is that capitalism allows these tools for exchange specifically when charity is not enough. Now, many of other arguments that I've heard about capitalism aren't really systematic arguments at all. They're rather assertions about different types of people. So I think it's important to focus on the system as opposed to the people. So if you're going to imagine a system with generous socialists, then you're going to have to compare that to a system with generous capitalists. You're going to have to hold the type of people constant and then just look at those specific differences that are directly attributable to the system. And I think doing that will allow a more fair comparison in which capitalism has advantages which these others don't have. All right, so I don't know how long that was, but I think you can take it away from here.
All right. And James, when you said you had a picture for Krampus, I assumed it would be a Krampus.
I'm not sure what one is.
It's an evil Santa Claus
You
that
serious?
follows. Yeah, he follows.
Whoa.
It's like in Scandinavian countries, he follows Santa around and like punishes the bad kids.
I just Googled it and I'm like frightened. That is scary. But
Well,
yes, go ahead, Snake.
Yes, acceptable avatar either way. So basically, I used to be a socialist, and I flipped to capitalism a few years ago. Specifically, I was an anti-capitalist. Like, I hated capitalism, but I think it was kind of a straw man that I built up. I had kind of a resentment for, the rich people and the fact that there wasn't enough social safety nets. But now I struggle with the implications of the implications of freedom when socialism is implemented, because I see it as attacking things like private property and the ability to seek profits, which I think are actually necessary, but not necessarily sufficient for a free society, but definitely necessary elements. And kind of what really made me leave my beliefs was just an actual hard look at the historical fact of every time socialism is implemented, it ends up in basically tyranny or collapse. And so I recognize that most socialists today reject the tyranny of things like Stalinism, but it seems like while they attempt to reject the ends, the means are still the same. So to abolish private ownership of property and the means of production would put the same crippling restrictions on the freedom of choice that characterized the failed regimes traditionally associated with communism and socialism. And while I did used to have this kind of resentment, because I saw the executive jobs as pretty easy, and while for a lot of people, for the people who occupy them, they probably are pretty easy, although a lot of them tend to be workaholics. Most people don't want to assume this kind of responsibility of making all these decisions, working 80 hours a week, or assuming the risk of the responsibility of the executive positions. Most people just want a relatively riskless position in this structure of a company where they just want to go to work, collect their paycheck, go home, and not have to think about these high level decision making or assume the risk of what happens if their decisions end up getting poor gains and end up possibly even collapsing the company. So I think, at least in my case, it was my dedication towards socialism was kind of based on an assumption that I'm owed resources and that business owners are withholding something that already belongs to me, that the surplus value that comes from the labor that should belong to that labor is being taken by the owners. But I think this is based on a fundamentally flawed assumption that that the workers are owed any value at all until they enter this agreement. And at that point, when you're entering an agreement, you're only owed what you agree to trade for. You trade your labor for a paycheck or whatever you agree. Maybe you agree to have your rent taken care of or some sort of living arrangement taken care of. But it seems like socialists want more than what they actually agreed to trade for at that point in time. And some of this I recognize is because of the point of view that it's an inherently unethically exploitative sort of relationship where this type of trade is basically coerced onto the worker since workers need money. But I think this leaves out the fact that employers need workers too, and it now seems to me that capitalism makes employers as replaceable to workers as workers are to employers, because it allows individuals the ability to pursue their own personal goals and hiring options and business options, which increases the amount of competitive entities in the market. So as a worker, you do have a legitimate choice, especially since a job is not owed to you. A job is something that is a consensual agreement between two parties. But I also wanted to point out that seeking profit is not the only goal in private ownership. While it certainly is one of the more objectionable to the socialists, private ownership allows us to have this whole spectrum of designs. You can, for example, finance debates. I know James has needed to compensate some of the debaters, some of the higher level debaters, because they're more in demand, and that's totally fine to crowdfund or fund it pretty much any way you want, as long as you're not stealing from people or forcing them to give you money. But the profits, you could say, can also go towards charities, or you could crowdfund all kinds of events or goals, including social safety nets. Or a lot of times, most business owners actually are just covering the cost of their own living and maybe supplementing their income a little bit from another job that they have. And under capitalism, you can set up worker-owned co-ops and worker-shared means of production, and you can agree to get the same wages. So it seems to me even though I left socialism, I still have socialist values, but I've kind of changed my perspective in that capitalism is the best way to promote these values, since you can, in fact, create socialist firms within capitalism because you have that individual option to make these agreements with your employees. But the thing is that it would seem that socialists don't want the option to be able to make the agreement to take wages. They want to force the use of acquired resources to only be socialist in nature. But how am I doing on time here?
You have 2.5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll try to go quickly. So it seems that socialists make this pursuit mandatory, and I don't think that they quite understand the implications of this system, that it will end up the same as Stalinism, because you have to abolish the freedom to choose for yourself what happens to the wealth you've earned. Otherwise, if you don't abolish that, then you have the ability to acquire private property. And so I would like to know how this system runs, if not by state-run banks that control all the resources, where they're only released if and only if the majority of the workers vote to send resources and workers to that specific cause. It seems like it's decreasing the amount of freedom of choice of the workers and of people who just own and earn resources. So would they like to live in a society where resource production is approved if and only if a majority of workers vote for it? Or would you like these options to exist according to market demands, according to the drive of individuals who have individual economic rights and individual powers to decide what gets produced? What would happen to niche markets and risky decisions and innovations like the iPhone? Like it replaces books, flashlights, navigation systems, telephones, et cetera, all in one. What would happen to all of these things if these decisions had to be approved by a majority of worker votes or some kind of state-owned bank? It would seem like these kinds of things in the market would completely disappear, since they threaten jobs, they're risky, they don't have the personal investment of these voters that perhaps a individual entrepreneur or a small group of entrepreneurs using their own capital investments for niche interests and smaller markets that don't have wider popular appeal, as well as the fact that special interests will converge on these centers of power and will have greater ability to enforce oppressive systems onto workers, since there is less ability to compete and individuals can't just go off and do their own thing. Politicians would be able to suppress supply lines unilaterally, and labor would be dictated by other people in control.
Oh, you've got maybe about 10, 15 more seconds left.
Okay, so I guess I would go to I would say I think capitalism is the better way to get to socialism, and I think we should start off by defining what we mean by private property, because I think that's going to be a central aspect of disagreement in this.
You got it. We will now kick it over to our socialist guests. So thank you very much, Brenton and Krampus. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, James. And you can send my check. I'll put it with my checks from George Soros and my Antifa super soldier serum. All right. So the debate tonight is on capitalism. And this is a topic that I am really invested in because as a red-blooded American male, I was raised to love capitalism. And after all, who wouldn't love capitalism? Just look around. One could easily say upon first glance that we in America are living at the absolute pinnacle of human civilization. We elect our leaders rather than having them imposed upon us. We choose our jobs rather than having them chosen for us. Our stores are bursting with more products and food than we can even fully imagine, let alone buy and consume. And it would seem that the only thing standing between us and the American dream is our own willingness or lack thereof to work hard and apply our intelligence and our passion in this economic proving ground and make our fortune. And that's what our media and our textbooks and our universities and all of our experts tell us, that we're all the scrappy hero fueled by desire and ambition. And if we could just work hard enough and be smart enough, everything would turn out wonderfully. But of course, a big part of growing up is learning that this is not the case. The fact is that despite having all the power and convenience seemingly at our fingertips, people are unfulfilled and alienated, and many in the first world live in a state of extreme poverty and work themselves into an early grave for pennies on the dollar. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as of January 2019, there were at least 567,715 homeless individuals in the United States. And this problem has only been exacerbated by COVID and the looming eviction crisis we are all facing. 40 million Americans struggle with hunger in the United States. And in 2017, while our economy was booming around us, 15 million lived in food insecure households. As many as 1 in 6 children do not know where their next meal is coming from. And looming over all of this, like the sword of Damocles, is the seemingly impossible problem of global climate change, the effects of which we are already seeing. War, famine, pestilence, and environmental devastation on a previously unheard of scale. And it's not like there aren't solutions to all of these problems. There are 1.5 million empty homes in the United States. That is more than enough for each of the 568,000 or so homeless people. In fact, we could give them each 3 or 4 homes to themselves, and we'd still have homes left over that would remain empty. And that's just houses. Factoring in apartments and other smaller living spaces, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates that over 17 million vacant properties are vacant in the United States. And that's, again, before COVID and before the eviction crisis. Despite our prevalent problems with hunger, Americans waste 40% of the food we produce. We throw away 40 million tons of food a year. That is a literal metric ton of food per hungry person being wasted. 2,204.62 pounds a year, which factors out to more than double the daily minimum a healthy person needs to live comfortably. We have already failed to act on global climate change, and now we can do nothing but mitigate the damage caused by rising global temperatures. But had the fossil fuel industry not purposefully suppressed the information in the 1970s and 80s, and if they were not currently running multi-million-dollar propaganda campaigns to keep the scientific consensus obscured, even as they spend billions shoring up their own infrastructure against climate-induced threats like rising sea levels. Because at the end of the day, even as Exxon spent $31 million on disinformation campaigns aimed at the public, they believed their own scientists, who were in 100% agreement that the threat of human-caused global warming was real. That's 100%. That is 3% more than the 97% among general climate scientists. They knew this decades ago, and they chose to maliciously lie about it and were exposed in a leaked memo in 2015. But of course, they faced virtually no consequences for their actions. And similarly, no one is feeding those 40 million Americans, and landlords and banks are actively kicking more people out onto the street during an unprecedented global pandemic, and the food that we have harvested is rotting. And so I got to thinking, what even is capitalism? Why does everyone tell me it's so great? And if it is so great, why does it allow and perpetuate problems that include but are in no way limited to the 3 that I have just quickly listed? And so I did some reading and some searching and arguing, and I talked to economists and activists and historians, and I came to a definition that I think we can all more or less agree upon. Capitalism is an economic and political system that was developed in England in the 17th and 18th centuries, in which the vital industry and resources within a nation are owned by small groups of private individuals and operated for profit. It is characterized by speculative investment by moneyed individuals for the express purpose of turning a profit for those same individuals. This is the capitalist class, a group of elites who, by virtue of their ownership of land, technology, and resources, earn their living not by the sweat of their brow, but by reaping the benefits of profitable economic activity done by entities that they own and control. No matter your feelings about capitalism, if you work a job and earn a paycheck, and this paycheck is your primary means of subsistence, you are not a capitalist. You are a worker. Capitalism drives production and innovation by this method of speculative investment. Money is invested, new products are created, and businesses are perpetuated only because the investment keeps coming. If investors ever stop ever slow or stop investing or withdraw their funds in large enough numbers, the economy crashes, paychecks bounce, and people starve. This is what it means to work within an economy where profits are in command. So what has happened here is we have built a system where all of us are essentially beholden to the whims of a tiny overclass of individuals. Worse, this class is not entirely united. They do not act with a single mind or will, and collectively do not have any regard for what they are doing to the world around them. How can they? All they do is take money, invest it, and watch the numbers go up or down. And when the numbers go down, they freak out and retreat to their bunkers and gated communities and hold on to their remaining dragon's hoard of wealth to wait for a sunnier day. And that is just how it's supposed to work. This doesn't even begin to address the corruption, bugs, exploits, and outright gaming of the system that clever and malicious individuals engage in for their own benefit and at the expense of the rest of us. But there may still be those of you who are asking yourselves, why is this bad? Shouldn't people who take a risk with their money be rewarded? Don't we want that behavior? And in a certain very simplistic sense, you're right. But the problem is you're missing the forest for the trees. If our economic and political system is reliant on these individuals to continue to foot the bill and provide the lifeblood that keeps the gears of our economy turning, how can we ever get them to stop when we need them to stop? Except in rare cases, they don't actually see the whole picture. They don't care that Coca-Cola hired mercenaries to murder union leaders in Nicaragua. They didn't care when the British East India Company purposefully starved 10% of the entire Indian subcontinent to death within a single year. They didn't care when Leopold II murdered 40 million Congolese, all to acquire a large stockpile of rubber and several tons of different kinds of rocks and minerals. They didn't feel bad about American chattel slavery, and they don't feel bad when a clothing factory collapses in Bangladesh, killing thousands, or a Foxconn factory in China drives its workers to suicide assembling iPhones. Or if they do care, they don't put two and two together and realize that all of this inhumanity is happening just to make the numbers in a computer go up. Essentially, what we have done, what capitalism does on the macro level, is place the levers of power into the hands of people who have nothing to do with the actual source of their income and no idea sometimes that the levers are even in their hands. As such, we must only depend on synergy to make sure that these activities which make those numbers go up are actually socially desirable activities. Now, sometimes they are, because synergy is an important principle in nature. And often we find that we are guided towards an end that none of us individually can envision, but collectively benefit from. But this is not the be-all and end-all of human activity, and allowing people with no real skin in the game to drive the car that is human society is going to wind up running us right off a cliff, and in fact, it may already have. We desperately need to move beyond this system and must break the power of the capitalist class and come together around a better, more sane and compassionate system if we are to survive the next few centuries. We urgently need to solve the riddle of a better way to live for ourselves, for our children, and ultimately our planet. Because if we do not, if human society cannot adapt to a changing world, we will drive ourselves to extinction, and it will be no one's fault but our own. Now, as this debate continues, and I'm going to be advocating for a more sane system, and I believe that system is socialism leading into communism, and we can get into that later. But for now, what we need to do is realize that capitalism is not working, and we have to move beyond it immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll kick it over to Krampus.
All right. So I accepted this debate today to talk about two main issues. One being my support of market socialism, where businesses would become worker-owned cooperatives and be run democratically, and the other being my extremely heavy disagreements with, I guess what you would call libertarian capitalism, where you believe market forces can replace most, if not all, government-run sectors of the economy and self-regulate enough to avoid and prevent any negative externalities from running rampant in your society. I do believe a large portion of what this debate comes down to is capitalism versus democracy, as I want to make our capitalist workplaces democratic, and you want to replace a democratic government with capitalist market forces. So what I have compiled in preparation for this debate is a list of examples of data showing how, one, worker co-ops are superior to traditionally owned firms, and two, that removing most forms of government programs and regulation would create a number of problems and externalities that the profit motive would have no reason to address. However, before we get into that, I want to establish a few facts about today, because to the average American right now, capitalists and the business owner class have far more power over their daily lives and hell, even the direction of the country, than they have any sort of democratic representation of power in either. In a meta-analysis done by Cambridge University, they found that the percentage of policy passed that correlated with the opinions of the minority of wealthy people and business owners far outweighed even policy passed that had a majority of people support in America. This proves that our government's current democracy is functionally non-existent, and at this point exists only to serve the will of the capitalist class, the owners of the means of production. And thus my solution to this is to destroy the barrier between worker and owner and make every worker a cooperative owner of the business they work at. Worker co-ops are proven to generally provide better pay, benefits, produce overall happier workers. They're more likely to survive the first few years of business, are more resilient to economic downturn, have a lower turnover rate. They're even more productive. As it turns out, giving the average person some stock in the company they work for actually makes them feel more motivated to work and make something out of it. And most importantly, the average person will no longer have to submit themselves to an authoritarian power structure they have no control over just to survive in their society. I believe this will be the first step to restoring true democracy in our country, as the corrupting power of capital will no longer be relegated to a select few people who have a disproportionate amount of influence over our systems. All right, that was it.
You bet. Thank you very much. We will kick it into, I suppose if you'd like, you have 5 minutes left. Brenton, I know that I asked you to squeeze it down, so if you'd like, you can use more time.
I honestly, I feel pretty good on this. I think we can get into the question and answer. I could answer a few things that were brought up in the opening statements, but I feel like that's unfair since we're going to go into that anyway.
You got it. Then we'll jump into open conversation. Very excited. And with that, the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Well, how is owning a company an authoritarian power structure just because you get to decide who you associate with?
Oh, because they have no democratic control.
Yeah, when you are in a workplace, what the boss says goes.
Yeah, why are you entitled to tell someone what they do with their stuff?
Well, because
I don't get to vote on how you set up your living room.
I mean, yeah, but you don't actually have a stake in my living room. You have to spend 8 hours a day at working underneath a boss. I mean, that's like a third of your life.
You agree to that, though.
Well, yeah, but you agree to that under duress.
How is it duress? You're not owed. He's not withholding anything that you're owed.
Well, he's withholding something that you need. It's not the same thing as it necessarily being owed, though I would argue that we are owed the means of existence because we have a right to life, and life to sustain life in the modern world, you must obtain currency. So what's happening here is where we are is we're in a situation where the environment around us has been manipulated in order to incentivize certain choices and disincentivize other choices. And this has been done legally, it's been done economically, and it's been done morally with ideology. So I would kind of equate taking a job from a boss to you're sitting there on the edge of a cliff holding a rope, and the guy on the other end of the rope says, "Give me your watch or I drop you." That's the thing. Now, you may be able to choose to give your watch to 100 or 1,000 guys, but at the end of the day, that's still a coerced choice. It's a coerced choice in the way as if you've ever played like an open world video game that isn't really open world, and you try to walk and you hit an invisible wall, or the plot pushes you. You're told that there is a choice here, but effectively there is not a choice, because that's really what power is. Power wielded by a boss or a politician. It is the ability to expand or limit the amount of choices that someone else can make under certain circumstances.
This sounds like the this sounds like the classic work or starve objection to capitalism. Basically, you have to work or your alternative is to starve. So my claim here is that this is sort of an inherent fact of all society. So in order to live, you have to be able to get resources in one of those ways I mentioned. And you can't do it yourself. You can't produce everything yourself. You have no knowledge. You don't have access to goods outside of your immediate vicinity. You have to cooperate with any other people in no matter what society you live in. So you have to be able to work with and for other people in no matter what society you're going to live in, or you're not going to have access to those resources. So I don't see how that uniquely singles out capitalism as opposed to some alternative system.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that very easily. So, and thank you for bringing that up, because a lot of people do have a problem envisioning this. This is essentially the Jordan Peterson lobsters argument, where because hierarchies exist in nature, obviously human hierarchies as they are right now must therefore be fine and natural and preserved and don't change anything. Yes, absolutely, existence requires struggle. We need to obtain food, obtain resources. The issue is not with the actual struggle of existence, because when man struggles against nature to get resources, that's a very different situation than man struggling against man. And the system that we have that has been created by men forces the majority of men to do their work under conditions that are imposed upon them by a tiny minority of men, because they happen to have the legal right to all of these resources. So it's not simply work or starve, though it's more likely what will happen is it's work or be thrown out onto the street and then be subject to vagrancy laws and then go to jail. And then once you're in jail, work or we beat you, or you go into solitary confinement. So again, like what's happening here is the environment itself has been shaped and changed by a specific class of humans over the centuries to incentivize the majority of humans who live underneath them to make the choices that they want, as opposed to those humans making the choices that we otherwise would want to do. And you can even see this if you go back to, for instance, the clearing of the commons and the enclosure acts in Britain, which were necessary to set up capitalism in the first place, to create these economic systems. And it even goes right back to the Jacobite Rebellion, where they were trying to put Bonnie Prince Charles on the throne because they were trying to preserve feudalism, and the capitalists were and the English were violently imposing capitalism on them. And if you look at the history of capitalism, it has been a long history of violence, usually targeted, by the English to the Scots, and then from the British to the Irish, and then from the British again through the British East India Company to the rest of the world, to the Americans, to the Americans with the slave trade. This is an exceptionally violent system of plunder. It's just harder to see, both because we haven't been given the education to understand it a lot of times, and we don't have the words oftentimes to express it. But all in all, there is a lot more going on here than appears to be on the surface.
So a quick correction. I never actually tried to make the Jordan Peterson lobster argument, as I didn't say.
Oh, no, it's a similar type of argument.
Well, no. It's actually, it's quite different in that I'm not saying that you always have to obey some authority or starve. I'm saying that you always are going to have to live by rules that other people that are not you have created, whether it's social norms, whether it's some sort of exchange. You're always going to have to do that or starve.
Yeah, certainly. But the difference is we're objecting to the specific rules, not to the idea that...
However, the key point is that you might dislike the rules, but the point is that those rules do not uniquely have the condition attached to them, work or starve. The work or starve condition is attached to either system in the same way. Now, you might disagree with the rules. Again, you might say, which type of rules should people live under which they work or starve? You could say people should work or starve under socialism. Or it's not the same thing. It's just saying in one case you get to work or starve, whereas this other case, what? I mean, we haven't even heard of a whole much.
The issue is not work or starve. The issue is work for this guy or starve.
Yes,
I'm saying I'm specifically saying
to capitalism, not to working or starving. So that's the key point: is that it doesn't uniquely single out capitalism. To actually have a problem with capitalism, you'd have to say these other objections, like authority is problematic, concentrating his power is problematic. You have identified a number of other arguments which could be valid. My point is that those are not the same thing as just saying that capitalism is work or starve.
I mean, capitalism is work or starve, and other systems may be work or starve, but capitalism is work or starve to a unique degree that I find destructive and dangerous. And
why is it to a unique degree? I mean, I sort of haven't heard any explanation of how these goods or services are going to be provided. You said, give the homeless have stuff, or they don't have stuff, give them stuff. I mean, I mentioned in my opening remarks about how it can only be charity or exchange, essentially. So, I mean, and if you're just asserting that there's going to be more charity, there has to be some argument about how your system has more charity or why, as opposed to just, packing it into the definition of the system, whereas, capitalism is greedy by definition, socialism is more charitable by definition. If you're just packing that into the definition, it's just question begging.
I mean, I would actually
question begging, because it's packing that conclusion that capitalism is about greed into the very definition, so you don't feel like you even have to, defend that position. And I haven't.
I mean,
even
I
said
don't
anything
I don't
about
feel like
how it would
capitalism
do
is
that.
necessarily about greed. I think it incentivizes greed. My issue with capitalism is that profits are in command. And profits may be that you might call that greed. I'd actually think that it may even be less than greed, and just the fact that people have a uniquely negative reaction to loss as opposed to gain. So, for instance, like they did a psychological study with supermarkets where they said, okay, if you bring your own bags, we'll give you 6 cents additional. We'll give you 6 cents back. And people didn't care that they got an extra 6 cents. So they just didn't bring their own bags. But then they said, we're going to charge you an extra 6 cents if you bring your own bags. And people freaked out and started bringing their own bags because the fear of loss is so much more painful than success. And I think that's part of what ties into when profits are in command and we have these economic meltdowns because the speculation slows. I think that is one of like the major drivers, as opposed to something really simplistic like greed. But I mean, I think Krampus did a great job of illustrating a way that we might be able to live beyond capitalism with his market socialism. His whole opening statement was about that. So, I mean, that's one possible answer to how we could do this. I usually will advocate the use of swarm technology to aid in economic planning. But, all of the ways that we could deal with this, the main thing that I'm saying is that, capitalism is an antiquated system that has essentially outlived its usefulness and is causing us problems as a society. And I outlined 3 major problems that need to be solved that capitalism is standing in the way of. So I don't know, Krampus, do you want to lay in on that a little bit more?
Oh, I just wanted to mention that it's actually more cost effective to give homeless people homes than it is to keep them on the street. Sorry, I don't know. I was
you're
just
right.
addressing something about it earlier, but
Sure.
No,
On the question, you can continue. We've talked a bunch already. You can go, Krampus.
no, I don't really have any more anything else to say on that topic. I did want to ask about the libertarian solution to climate change. I don't know
Sure,
if you guys
yeah.
still wanted to finish up on that topic. You can. But...
I can briefly mention that unless Snake wants to.
Well, I'll just do a short thing. I think green technology really appeals to people, and I think that a lot of these problems that you're pointing out are actually problems with the government and not with the system of private ownership. I think capitalism has a unique degree of freedom where you can work for yourself, and I think that we're forgetting small businesses, but also you have the freedom to go and walk the walk and make worker-owned co-ops and just put your money where your mouth is. And I think that will help. I think that that's what we should do. But private ownership of property requires that. And the fact that, as I was saying earlier, problems with the government are kind of what seems to be ruining capitalism, is a lot of pollution I see as an aggressive action that should be stopped. That is not actually, it is an assault on people's private ownership. So Alex, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say that unfortunately, I don't think any system actually has a strong response to global warming. And I think the big problem actually highlights one of the advantages of capitalism. So the big problem with global warming is that the whole atmosphere is one giant, unowned, unmanaged commons. You can't actually have private ownership of air in any meaningful way. It's just not really any solution there in terms of that. And the problem is when you have this sort of giant, unowned thing, there isn't really any system that's going to generate a good answer to that. So that's basically what I'd say. That basically no one's got an answer to that.
Did you just advocate the private ownership of air, by the way?
No, I said they can't. It can't be. That's
right, but if it could be, would you advocate that?
I mean, it would be an entirely different physical world. So I don't know what I'd be advocating in that world.
I don't know if it's really an entirely different physical world, though, because I mean, there was a time that people saw the private ownership of land as bad as.
So to clarify, I'm just saying that even if you could just own, the air above your house, I don't think that would be sufficient. Like the problem is the transaction cost with negotiating across, every polluter on the entire planet is just astronomical, and there's There's not really any way to come to a consensus. So to illustrate in the other direction, imagine you have a commonly owned resource with one other person you live with. Say it's a TV. You can come up with some sort of agreement with them. I'm going to use it here, you use it then, and we're not going to damage it, etc. The transaction cost there is pretty low. Now imagine instead, in order to do anything with the TV, you need to get billions of people to agree. Well, now that cost of negotiating with all those people is astronomical, and now you can't do it. So it's a matter of scale. So even if you could own the air above your property, it really wouldn't solve that problem, because you'd still then have to have some way to negotiate in some sort of exchange with all these other countries all over the place, and I just don't see an answer there.
Yeah. So what I'll bring up as a part with green technology, and I hear this a lot of the time. The thing is that there's such a thing called greenwashing, where, and I see it a lot of the time out of companies all over the place, because yes, people love the idea of companies being green. But you get the same results out of pretending to be green as you do actually being green. And in fact, not only does pretending to be green, it's cheaper. So you actually get better results out of just saying that you're doing something and not actually doing something than doing it. I mean, like a big thing is like carbon offset emissions, for example, which is a completely unregulated industry, or was the last time I checked. I knew a guy on the Appalachian Trail. His big plan when he got off the trail was going to be to sell carbon offset emissions to companies. So he could do whatever he wanted. And he said, well, maybe I'll plant some trees, and or maybe I'll I'll buy a hybrid, and then I'll sell these. I'll say you get these many carbon offset emissions for this hybrid, and I can just do whatever I want because it's not regulated by the government, and they don't really care. They just want the proceeds. And people do that. I think there was an episode of King of the Hill about that. Now you mentioned also government and the fact that these are problems created by government. But the big problem here is, and this is why I defined capitalism as an economic and political system, as opposed to purely an economic system. The political system that we have is a direct result of the capitalist class and what they choose to do with their money and how they choose to build these governments. And, you've got John Locke, the great and chief end of men uniting into commonwealths is the preservation of their property. Adam Smith, civil government, as far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, of those who have some property against those who have none at all. In every single developed society, the rich always grab the levers of power and rewrite the rules to favor themselves remaining rich and to keep things going. And the state naturally responds to that and does what its primary constituents want to do, which, goes right back to Krampus pointing out that essentially we do not live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy with the appearance of democracy.
I'd say we do live in a democracy, and this is just what democracy looks like. So when you do have that concentrations of power, there can be exchanges made in favor of that. So this is just what democracy looks like. If you don't like it, maybe you should reconsider democratic control.
Well, I would say this is what democracy looks like, is what we used to say in the street at Occupy Wall Street. And I bet you it's still what they're saying right now out on the streets with Black Lives Matter, because democracy is people having a say in their government, in the running of their society, and having a significant say. We have seen, again, we can apply these democratic principles to business. We can apply these democratic principles to industry, to property. And I think that what you're going to find is when you do apply those principles, it's going to be much easier to negotiate with people over something like global warming, for instance, because then people have skin in the game. And then again, things are not being driven by profits for a group of people who are disinterested and have no skin in the game.
So
it's also much
how would centralizing more control and power over the government result in less corruption?
I mean, I'm an anarchist, so I would suggest we destroy the state, which is destroy the military and the police, replace it with nothing, which then leaves no ability to protect private property whatsoever, which then causes the government and industry to fall into the hands of those who actually already hold it and possess it, which are the workers.
We just saw that fail with the Chaz, and they shot a bunch of black people too. So
whoa.
Didn't work.
So first off, no, the Chaz is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the elimination of the state overall. This is the way humans lived before the rise of the state some 6,000 years ago. Now, the Chaz itself, first off, was under attack from right-wing people. Like, two of the major incidents were like Proud Boys or fascists or something shooting into the Chaz and killing people in the Chaz. The most recent the most recent thing happened as a result of supposedly what's been reported is a carjacker stole a car and drove to the Chaz supposedly for protection. And because there had been car attacks before that, the Chaz security forces thought it was yet another car attack and fired back. And there was an exchange of fire between the carjacker, who was armed because he needed to be armed to jack a car, and the Chaz security forces. That has nothing to do with worker ownership of the means of production. That has nothing to do with an anarchist society. That was some activists seizing a small area of territory and trying to do something similar to what was done with Occupy Wall Street in 2008.
That's what happens when you abolish private property.
No, it's not. Wait, you think we just start killing each other when you abolish private property?
If you say let loose the communists and just stop all police protection, stop people from being able to protect their own property, yeah, there's
No. Whoa, hang on, because you actually brought this up with the issue with private property versus personal property. Private property.
I think you guys are a little bit strawmanning what we think capitalism is, at least. And private.
I mean,
property.
did you disagree with my definition of capitalism?
Yeah.
How?
I don't think it's a political thing.
Okay, so if it's you may not think that, but can you tell me why it's not a political thing?
As we understand, I think Alex is on the same page with me. Is it's just the private trade of property.
Okay, and what conditions need to be in place for that private trade to occur?
So this is a sort of a pretty common anti-capitalist anarchist trope that's for something unique about private property, which requires a state as opposed to all the other rules which you believe are still going to be enforced. I've never heard any serious explanation of why private property uniquely requires a state. It seems to be all the arguments that would suggest that private property requires a state would equally suggest that any other sort of rule or personal property would require a state. So, but that's a bit.
Yeah, private property. No. Hang on, I'm not going to let that go unanswered, Alex. So, private property is unique in that it requires a state because private property is property that is not possessed by the owner or used by the owner. Rather, it is possessed and used by someone who is not the owner on behalf of the owner. And the only way to maintain that relationship, the only way to own something that you don't have and you don't use is via a state or similar institution that will use violence to make sure that if the person who has it and actually does use it, uses it in a way that you don't want it to be used, is punished for that. So yeah, it absolutely requires a state.
That's an assertion, not an argument, but that's also not really what we're talking about. It's about capitalism more. So I don't want to get too sidetracked.
We should understand what the difference is when socialists make an argument about private property versus personal property. Personal property is your house, your business, your car. It is the stuff that you physically have and keep in your possession and can defend without
an old lady, living in her house alone defends it. And if she can't defend it, she requires a state.
I would say absolutely an old lady living in her house defends it because by using the house, one, she's got friends, she's got family.
Stop. So right there, you've already introduced other mechanisms of enforcing property that don't require you to be there. So
certainly, but other mechanisms are not the state.
Hold on, Brent.
Yeah.
If those other mechanisms, whether those other groups, that you might be a part of, friends, family, can defend it, even if you're some old sick lady, then they could similarly defend it if you weren't present. And if every argument that you would suggest that would say only the state is required for private property would also apply to this old lady who can't defend it. So you can't say that this old lady.
No, it wouldn't apply to the old lady.
Why not?
Because there's a difference between an informal defense by people's friends and family and personal network, and an institutional defense by a professional organization whose job it is to use violence against people. There's a difference between.
So the state is just an institution that uses violence. So any institution emancipation. I mean,
the state is any institution. Yeah, the state is any institution which is managed to claim a total monopoly over the justified use of violence within a given geographical area. So, you've got the United States military and the United States police force. Together, they are the state. Similarly, there's a state in Russia and a state in China. That's the state. Now, there's also other organizations that use violence that are licensed underneath the state. Usually they're mercenary companies or private security companies. But if the state, for instance, if the United States fell effectively and say Blackwater came in and took over, a large section of the country, then Blackwater would be the state, and maybe Blackwater has subcontractors, maybe they don't. But yeah, that's the definition of the state from Max Weber. That's the accepted.
The not real anarchist argument is sort of purely semantic, purely question begging, and sort of
sure, but I'm not making a not real anarchist argument.
It's a bit sidetracking. I think we can talk more about some of the stuff we've mentioned. So I actually wanted to make a point about democracy, specifically something that Krampus brought up. Made two key points. First of all, he did mention that the interests of the government do more closely follow the opinions of the wealthy than they do regular people. So the first thing that you want to be careful of is the opinions of the wealthy do not necessarily correlate to the interests of the wealthy. So for example, the wealthy are more anti-war, they're more tolerant of homosexuality, they're actually in favor of higher taxes slightly. So the interests of the wealthy don't automatically correlate to their opinions. So if you actually had a world where their influence was less, you'd have less anti-war, more intolerance of homosexuality, and ironically